Welcome to this edition of Democracy Dialogues, a conversation we need to have now about the state of democracy in the Americas. My name is Eric Farnsworth, and I'm delighted to be your series host. Today, I'm speaking with Carlos Fernando Chamorro, who is in San Jose, Costa Rica, where he is in exile from his native Nicaragua. Carlos is an independent journalist who founded the news website Confidencial. He has a fascinating background, having been an early supporter of Daniel Ortega, and in fact working closely with him during the 1980s. The son of former Nicaraguan President Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, who defeated Ortega in the 1990 elections, Carlos edited the FSLN paper Barricada until the mid-1990s, when in fact we first met each other. Carlos Fernando, I don't know if you would remember that, but that was the first time, a long time ago, when I was the Nicaragua desk officer at the U.S. Department of State. At the time, we believed that democracy, though nascent, had been established in Nicaragua, and that the political and economic future of the country would be much brighter. But in fact, as Nicaraguans head to the polls on November 7, 2021, Daniel Ortega and his wife, Rosario Murillo, have taken every step to ensure that they will remain in power, that the vote is merely a formality, having rounded up and jailed or exiled virtually every viable opposition leader, critic, and influencer. Meanwhile, the international community appears to be impotent to do much of anything about it. Carlos Fernando, welcome to Democracy Dialogues from your temporary home in San Jose, Costa Rica.
Thank you, Eric.
Before we get to the question of how Nicaragua got here, let me ask you about your own personal journey, which is fascinating, from Ortega supporter to exilee. What was your path? Give us a sense of your own growth and maturity in terms of these democracy issues.
Well, it's a long journey. I was involved in the Sandinista revolution, not defined as an Ortega supporter, but defined as a supporter of social change and democracy and the overthrow of the Somoza dictatorship. And it all happened after my father's assassination on January the 10th, 1978. I became a journalist. I was an economist, and I became a journalist, and I was involved also in the revolution. And I supported this process that generated hope and at the same time generated contradictions because of its own process of political radicalization. And I think there were some accomplishments of the revolution, but there were significant failures. The most important one was the war. It was a civil war, and there was also a foreign aggression war financed by the US. By 1990, there was an opportunity for change. I still supported the FSLN. My hope was that in a condition of peace, Nicaragua would transform in a different direction. But my mother, Violeta Chamorro, won the election, and I was among many other Sandinistas who accepted the results and said, well, this is an opportunity for change, an opportunity for democratic transition. I don't think Daniel Ortega thought the same way. Although he initially recognized the result of the election, but he wasn't really supporting the possibility of a democratic transition. So that was my evolution. Early in the 90s, again, I was the editor of Barricada when it was no longer a party paper, but it was more like an autonomous paper. And I ended up being kicked out of the paper in 1994 during the Sandinista crisis, when a group of FSLN supporters tried to make out of the FSLN a democratic left party. We failed. Ortega won, and he controlled the party. And I will guess the party is no longer what it used to be. This is more now a political machinery under the control of a caudillo and a family. So since 19 95, 96, I founded Confidencial, and I became an independent journalist, following my same dreams of democracy and social justice, but not attached to any kind of political party. This is what I have been doing in the last 25 years. And when Ortega came back to power, I was certain that he will try to stay forever and that he will not allow this continuously transition of democracy in Nicaragua. I don't think I was wrong. I denounced corruption from the first month, and I also suffered the reprisals of repression from the very first moment of the Ortega regime.
And now that they have essentially seen you to be a very inconvenient personality in Nicaragua, tell us how that's affected your personal and professional life in the context of where you are physically now.
The independent press in Nicaragua became an object of repression, but particularly when people took out the streets. When we have this national civilian insurrection in 2018, the press became the enemy for Ortega to get rid of it. They imposed censorship. They killed a journalist. They took over against reporters. And they ended up occupying my own newsroom, Confidencial, in December 2018. I was forced to exile for the first time. And I went back to Nicaragua at the end of 2019 to claim for my rights. But again, on May 20 this year, my newsroom was occupied for the second time. So I could no longer stay in Nicaragua because I would be in prison. I would be silenced. And the only way I can do journalism is from exile from Costa Rica. But this is not a unique, let's say, singular situation. There are many other journalists who are in the same situation, and that many other Nicaraguans that were either killed in the repression of 2018, more than 300 individuals. All these assassinations are in impunity, and there are hundreds of them in prison today, including my own brother, Pedro Joaquin, or my sister, who is under house arrest, and many others, not only, let's say, presidential candidates, but also journalists, businessmen, student leaders, peasant leaders. Anyone who could defy the power of Ortega is now under repression in a situation of a police state in which we live in Nicaragua.
Yeah, I think you're making a very, very important point. And I was going to ask you, of course, you have a very famous name. You yourself are a famous personality. I suppose in some dark way, it makes sense that the regime would target you and your family. But what you're indicating as well is that the regime is targeting all kinds of different sectors and all kinds of different people, even people who aren't necessarily famous or well established. What is the rationale for this? I mean, it's not just the elections on November 7, is it? There must be a broader issue here.
There is no clear rationale about how a dictator grabs power and tries to retain power. Okay, one could look at election. Ortega is not willing to risk his power in an election, but he doesn't either want to allow people to exercise their freedoms. He doesn't want people marching in the street. So those who are in prison are not only the presidential candidates, are also, let's say, the leader of the popular and social networks that could mobilize the people either in different ways. There is no freedom of expression, freedom of mobilization, or freedom of reunion in Nicaragua. We live under a police state that was established in September 2018, after Ortega had finished the massacres of against the protests of 2018. So it's a double repression against election, but also against the exercise of any kind of political and democratic freedom.
Carlos Fernando, the Organization of American States just recognized the circumstances that you're discussing right now. Just recently, the OAS resoundingly passed a resolution to condemn the electoral process and ongoing repression in Nicaragua. In fact, 26 countries voted in favor and 0 against. There were a number of abstentions, but in the hemispheric context, this is an overwhelming majority. What is it that you think that the international community has particularly keyed on in this context? Is it the repression of political leaders? Is it freedom of the press? Is it lack of accountability for the regime? Is there something else? What do you think is the primary motivator at this stage from the international community perspective?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important, the vote that you just mentioned at the OAS, also the resolutions by the European Union. It shows that Ortega is isolated from a human rights point of view. But I guess what is needed is that the international community to go one step beyond. And by addressing the issue of the November 7 ritual elections, whether they will give the result of this process political legitimacy. How could they accept the results if they don't recognize the process? If the process is biased because the competitors are in prison and there are no guarantees, well, we expect the international community, both the OAS and the European Union, to go a step further. How would they do that? It's something I don't know. I'm not a policy maker, either in the US or in Europe, but I would expect from a Nicaraguan point of view, political and economic and diplomatic pressure that will have an impact internally in Nicaragua. And I think this is the key issue. This crisis will not be solved in the US, in Washington, or in Brussels. It will be solved in Managua. In the first day, Nicaraguans have the capacity to exercise freedom of reunion and freedom of mobilization and freedom of the press. So whatever the international community plans to do, we'll have to think about what impact will it have in the restoration of democratic freedoms in Nicaragua. That is, in my opinion, the real point.
Let's stick with that for just a moment. You just published, in fact, in Confidencial, a fantastic piece, if I can say, which was entitled A Roadmap to Restore Democracy in Nicaragua, ended with a question mark. But some of the things in your excellent piece you've just commented on in terms of, in particular, change has to come from Nicaraguans themselves, which I think most people would certainly agree with. What are some of the other recommendations that you would have in terms of helping the Nicaraguan people restore democracy, or at least return to the democratic path in Nicaragua, based on some of your recommendations that you've just recently written?
I think there is a depth. I think the international community is in depth with the Nicaraguan pro-democracy movement. And as I refer in that op-ed, in March 2019, there was an agreement that the Ortega's government signed with the opposition to restore democratic freedoms in Nicaragua, and he never complied. And this agreement, this was a result of the second national dialogue in Nicaragua, and it had two important witnesses, a representative of the OAS, Mr. Rosario, and the representative of the Vatican, Mr. Valdemar Sommertag. Okay, the witness did not do anything to guarantee the accomplishment of this agreement. And I think if the international community will have to gain credibility, it will have to be there in order for these agreements to be accomplished. That's a very important point. Secondly, well, I think the US and the OAS will have to have also the companion of Central America. Now, what happened with our neighbors, with Honduras, with Guatemala? They were both absent in the OAS. We need all Central America together, supporting the Nicaraguan pro-democracy movement, like Costa Rica is doing that, Panama, the Dominican Republic, and others. And I think, well, the international community will have to persuade and to convince the Central American governments that the Nicaraguan crisis is also a regional crisis. It will have an impact on migration. It will have an impact on the economy. It will have an impact on security. And I think another important focus point will be to look at those sources of finance, of public finance, that have been important for the Ortega regime to gain sources of support. I'm talking about the Central American Integration Bank, even the IMF and the Inter-American Development Bank. There is no really demand on accountability on the Nicaraguan government on any issue, on how to use the money for emergency, how to use the money for COVID-19. There are many aspects in which they could have an impact, but probably the point of departure will have to be to have, I guess, a consensus between the international community and the Nicaraguan pro-democracy movement in order to put on the first place the liberation of all political prisoners and the elimination of their trials, because Ortega wants to inhabilitate politically all those who are in prison today. So that's the first point to open a possible solution to the Nicaraguan crisis, to liberate all political prisoners.
I fully agree with that. I think that is just basic decency, much less, a path toward democracy. But I fully agree with what you're saying. It's also interesting to note that the resolution of the crisis from the 1980s occurred in particular because Central America was united, and Central America could rally around the need for solution and came up with specific ideas for how to do that. And I wonder, in today's context, you referenced a couple Central American countries who abstained at the OAS. Is Central American regional solidarity a possibility at this point? And it's a difficult question to ask because, if the answer is no, then that obviously makes any sort of possible, peaceful resolution in Nicaragua that much more difficult. What's your sense about that? How might we be able to get Central America more unified around the need for a return to democracy in Nicaragua?
At this moment, the answer to this question is no. That's why Costa Rica is building an alliance with Panama and Dominican Republic to do what our other neighbors are not willing to do. But I would expect the US, the OAS, and the international community to persuade Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Well, El Salvador has been supporting the pro-democracy movement. No matter what we have to say about the fears, about the tendencies of Bukele's government, he's been consistent in supporting the Nicaraguan pro-democracy movement. Not the same thing with with Guatemala and Honduras. So I think we need political pressure on Honduras and Guatemala to join this regional effort. There is no leadership in Central America right now that one could think that could put together the region. So we need cooperation, multilateral cooperation with the international community. And that's what we are trying to do. I'm saying the Nicaraguans are calling to our neighbors to join this initiative and this effort.
I think the lack of regional leadership, I think that's a critically important point, because again, if we look back at the 1980s and some of the Reconstruction period of the 1990s, there was meaningful leadership coming from Central America, of course, Oscar Arias, but many others as well. And that does seem to be lacking in some way across the region. Let's turn the focus a little bit to, you mentioned three countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, which have a perhaps unique position right now in the context of U.S. policy toward Latin America, a real focus in terms of the Northern Triangle countries because of migration. And so one would imagine that the U.S. would have a certain amount of leverage, if we can say, to encourage a more forthcoming attitude on the Nicaraguan democracy movement. But let me ask it with specific reference to Nicaragua, the United States, and other countries, other international institutions. You mentioned some of the international financial institutions have real financial leverage on Nicaragua through trade preferences, through financial lending. At what point does it become advantageous to really consider some serious economic sanctions to go along with some of the political sanctions that have been discussed? Is this something that gets the attention of the Ortega-Murillo regime in a positive way, or is it counterproductive, or is it of no particular relevance one way or the other? What would be your views on that?
I think Ortega is concerned about having access to international lending, finance, and grants. And he has got very important support from Taiwan, for instance. Taiwan is also is an extra-regional member of the Central American Integration Bank, like South Korea or Spain and Mexico and Argentina. There are some, let's say, non-Central American members of the Central American Integration Bank that will have a stake on this issue about the support that the Central American Integration Bank is giving to Ortega. Now, in general, I believe the important thing is to establish standards of accountability and pressure through the international lending organizations. I believe I don't think anyone from a Nicaraguan perspective, either business or citizens or workers, would like to face a situation in which there are economic sanctions affecting the population. The sanctions up to now have been focused on individuals and some of the Ortega's business. And he claims that they're affecting the Nicaraguan people, but they're only affecting Ortega's group, Ortega's mafia. Now, it has to go beyond that, but without affecting the population. Otherwise, Ortega will try to become the champion of all those affected by sanctions, not only in Nicaragua, but the business class in Central America. So from a Nicaraguan point of view, I believe it's important to put the emphasis on economic, political, and diplomatic pressure, but preserving Nicaraguans' rights and preserving the Nicaraguan economy.
Yeah. No, it's very much a delicate issue. There's no question about it, and it is a conflict of policies that the U.S. and others face on many similar circumstances, no doubt. Thank you for that perspective. Very, very well said. One of the things that people say is the easiest way to break the will or break the hope of political prisoners and protesters is for them to believe that the rest of the world has forgotten about them, that they have no contact with the outside world, that nobody cares about that, nobody cares about them or their well-being. And you've referenced political prisoners, you've referenced students, political leaders, etc. What would be your message to them today in terms of where the international community is and what are the prospects for a return to democracy that will allow them to, frankly, be returned from exile and brought out of jail and restored to some semblance of normalcy? Are they forgotten, or are people working to their release?
I think people are working on their release every day, every moment. I'm talking about Nicaraguan society, mostly abroad, and their families in Nicaragua. They fear of repression. They are under persecution. The government has made an effort to make them invisible, but it has not been able to break a single individual in prison. The political prisoners have their image, their credibility, their projection has become much more bigger and larger because of the repression. The last poll that came out by Sid Gallup and Costa Rican company said if elections were today, 19% will vote for Ortega and 65% will vote for any candidate of the opposition, and all those are in prison. And they do have a much more favorable opinion. They double Ortega in terms of their favorable opinion in comparison with the political prisoners. I think there is a missing voice in this humanitarian and political crisis of the political prisoners. And this is Pope Francis, the Vatican. Where is the Vatican? The Vatican was a witness in the national dialogue in Nicaragua. Is the Vatican diplomacy working underground in a way that we're not seeing it? Well, we want to see the results if that is the case. If not, I think it will be very important the moral authority and the moral power of the Pope Francis with the Ortega dictatorship to demand openly the release of the political prisoners and to demand openly to stop the persecution against the Catholic Church in Nicaragua.
I think that's a really important point. And I would reiterate the question, where is Pope Francis in this issue? His voice is loud and it resonates, particularly on humanitarian grounds. And I would frankly say the same in terms of Venezuela and Cuba and other countries around the hemisphere that are faced with similar oppression. But certainly with reference to Nicaragua, that might play a very meaningful role. Carlos Fernando, we don't have a lot of time left. Do you have hope? Or let me ask you a different question. What gives you hope in the context of moving beyond the elections, we put in quotes on November 7th, and returning Nicaragua to some democratic path? What are the green shoots here from democracy activists? How can we come alongside and support them? What gives you hope in this context?
I think the November the 7th event, I cannot call it an election, there's no competition, there's no accountability, will aggravate the situation. Situation will get worse in terms of the economic impact, in terms of the question about the legitimacy of Ortega's new government. So what will the international community do? What will the Nicaraguan national community do? There are many questions and a lot of uncertainty. I don't think the Ortega's regime is sustainable in the long run, but it can stay in power longer by repression, by having full political and economic control of the country. And we require to rebuild the Nicaraguan pro-democracy movement. We require to deal with the human rights crisis. And I think the first point in which everybody would agree, apart from the liberation of political prisoners, is the return to Nicaragua of the International Human Rights Organization, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights from the OAS, and the Human Rights Organization from the United Nations. We need them back in Nicaragua so that they would give some kind of a minimum guarantee to start the process in which exiles can come back to Nicaragua. Without the presence of these two organizations, I think it will be impossible for any exile to come back to Nicaragua. So I am optimistic in the long run, but unfortunately in the short run, I can only see an aggravation of the political crisis.
Well, Carlos Fernando Chamorro, we've covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. But this is one reason why we were so excited to be able to attract you to this session of Democracy Dialogues, your deep understanding and perspective of the situation in Nicaragua. You've given us a lot to think about. You've improved our understanding of the circumstances in Nicaragua. And at the end of the day, I do think there is hope for change in Nicaragua, but it's going to take a lot of change. It's going to take continued pressure from the international community, and it will admittedly take a little bit of luck, I think, but hopefully luck is on our side. I really want to thank you again for joining us. I hope you'll join us again at some point, but in the meantime, please be safe, and please accept our very best wishes and regards from Washington. Ladies and gentlemen, this will conclude our session of Democracy Dialogues. We hope you will join us again for our next session, which will be announced very soon. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you, Eric.